Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second HighTea social in celebration of International Women's Day. My name is Megan Middleton. I'm the Associate Director of Advancement in the Faculty of Science. And I'm really excited to welcome you here today. We have a really great group of women who are going to chat with us about what Break the Bias means to them. But before we do, I have just a few housekeeping comments. First of all, the event is being recorded. Second of all, your audio and your video have been disabled, so don't worry, we can't see you, we can't hear you. Hopefully you're still enjoying your coaster, but don't worry. I suggest watching the event in gallery view, which will mean you'll get to see all the speakers at the same time. If you don't know this in Zoom, you can find it in the top right corner of your screen. Our panelists want to know your thoughts about the event, so please use the chat function throughout the event. Let them know what you think, provide your comments, tell them what a great job they're doing, and after the event, I'll be sure to send them a copy. I'm sure you can imagine that while they're chatting, they might not be able to keep up with the chat, but they will want to see it afterwards. Lastly, if you want to share comments on social media, and we hope you do, please consider using the hashtags Break the Bias and UWaterlooSci. I'd also, as I just quickly did earlier, I'd like to give a shout out to the Women in Physics and Astronomy group. They're gathered at the Grad House. This is one of their first ever in-person events, so we're really excited that they're able to join us today. I choose to believe they're giving a little cheer now if we could hear them. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kirsten Mueller. Kirsten is the first woman chair of biology, is a thoughtful leader, a compassionate mentor, and an advocate of equity and diversity. So thank you, Kirsten, for joining us today and for getting things started.
Thank you so much, Megan, for those kind words. And good afternoon, everyone. Happy International Women's Day. I'm so happy to be here and celebrate and acknowledge the incredible contributions and inroads that women continue to make around the world. As you are aware, this year the theme of International Women's Day is Break the Bias. And today we have an exceptional panel of science alumni who embody this theme in its entirety. This is going to be an insightful and lively discussion. But before we go any further, I would like to note that the University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. And our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campus through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized also within our Indigenous Initiatives Office. And wherever you are joining us from today, I recommend that you take a look at nativeland.ca that Megan just dropped in the chat for us to see the Indigenous communities that call your region home. I was also asked to share my story about breaking the bias, and I sat down and thought about this from different angles, including how I examine my own implicit biases, how I build awareness in myself as to how these shape my interactions in my role as chair, as a researcher, and as an instructor. But when I reflect, I strongly feel that biases were broken for me by the strong role models that I had in my grandmother and my mother. My grandmother raised 5 children as a displaced person after World War II, and she exhibited incredible strength under such terrible conditions for her and her children. My mother completed a nursing degree and then a master's while being a single mother of 3 and went on to leadership positions in hospitals that she worked at. By learning about and watching both of these strong women, I realized I didn't question my own ability to move into leadership roles, and it actually seemed an almost natural progression. I realize now that I watched my mother break those biases for me, and I continue to do the same for my own children. I also think about the people who will come after me in the role of chair. So I note to you that being in a leadership position of any kind is a way to bring about change, break bias, and extend a hand to lift those up who come after us in these roles. And with this in mind, I will leave you with some words by the poet and UW alumnus, Rupi Kaur, and her poem entitled Legacy. I stand on the sacrifices of 1 million women before me, thinking, what can I do to make this mountain taller so that the women after me can see farther? Thank you. Now I would like to introduce you to our host of this event, Jennifer Parks. Jen is the first woman director of the Geological Engineering program. She's also worked as an instructor and academic advisor for the Department of Earth and Environmental Science since 2012, where she teaches labs and lectures in areas including mineralogy, petrology, and field mapping. Her current research is focused on using field and lab-based techniques to study the tectonic evolution of an Archean greenstone and test different tectonic models in the Archean period. I can't think of a better person to lead us in all of today's panel. And to our four other panelists, Taylor, Diana, Elizabeth, and Nesra, thank you for being with us today and for discussing all the various and inspirational stories of how you break bias. It's absolutely wonderful to hear such stories from our science alumni, and you are a source of pride to all of us in the Faculty of Science. And finally, to our guests watching today, thank you for submitting your stories and reasons for breaking the bias. I'm incredibly inspired by what I've read. And you remind me that we all need to break the bias every day and in every way we can. And now I'll pass it over to you, Jen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. I really appreciate your thoughtful comments and that warm introduction. So hello, everyone. And welcome. Thanks for choosing to spend some of your International Women's Day with us. And I encourage you all to get comfortable, sit back and enjoy what I know is going to be a really thought-provoking and interesting conversation around this whole concept of breaking the bias. What breaking the bias means to me personally is not putting any limits on the goals that I set for myself and to act now to make the changes that I want to see in the future. All right, so let's get to know our panelists before we jump into our conversation. So our first panelist is Elizabeth Kennedy. She is a hydrogeologist, and she has spent her career working in the broad field of the environment. And currently, she's the director of water at Environment and Climate Change Nova Scotia. So in this current role, Elizabeth leads a team of scientists, engineers, planners, and technicians with the singular goal of simple and outcome-based regulatory protection for drinking water, water resources, aquatic habitats, and coastal areas. In Liz's career, she spent a lot of time developing, coaching, and mentoring her team members, and she always focuses on new graduates and new Canadians when she does this. When Liz isn't working, she spends a lot of time at arenas and beaches with her husbands, her two sons, and her dog, Digby. What breaking the bias means to Elizabeth is to leverage her position of power to bring diverse perspectives and voices to decision-making, both by voicing her diverse perspective as a woman in STEM and by actively making space at the table for other diverse perspectives. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jen. I'm so happy to be here.
Great. Our next panelist is Diana Chu. She started her career in business and corporate development through evaluating IP licensing deals in biotech and medical device companies. She has also worked in the aviation and technology sectors and currently is the partnership and business development lead at DuckDuckGo, an internet search engine that emphasizes protecting searchers' privacy. She also sits on the board of Free Geek, a technology reuse social enterprise that focuses on digital inclusion at affordable prices. What breaking the bias means for Diana is to continually speak up to have your voice heard. And it's also persistence in supporting other women to do the same by making space for their voices. When Diana isn't working, she spends time with her husband and two young sons enjoying nature and playing soccer. Diana, I'm really excited you've been able to join us today.
Great, thanks for having me.
All right, our next panelist is Nesra. So Nesra works in public health and spent the beginning of her career working in New York to increase services for people living with HIV. Since then, she's also worked as a senior program manager in maternal and child health at the Hospital for Sick Children. Currently, she's a senior lead of policy and system initiatives at the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. In her career, she has consistently advocated for gender equality in HIV treatment and believes in uplifting other women and believes diversity is the critical lens through which we all must work. What breaking the bias means to her is being intentional with our goals and to break through the noise and speak up so we can all succeed. Nezra, thanks a lot for being here and joining our conversation today.
Very happy to be here.
Awesome. And last but certainly not least is Taylit Ardan. Taylit has worked in the pharmaceutical and biotech sectors in many different countries and with many different companies. Currently, she's the Associate Vice President and Head of the Oncology Business for Eli Lilly and Company's International Business Unit, which is based out of Geneva, Switzerland. Taylit is passionate about supporting women in her current role and is heavily involved with Eli Lilly's Women in Leadership Resource Program. What breaking the bias means to Taylit is that breaking the bias starts with our own action, and it believes we need to lead by example, and we cannot be afraid to speak up and push back against biases when we encounter them and find ourselves in an environment that does not reflect our own values. And I'd like to give Taylit an extra special thanks for being here today. Taylit recently had twins, and she has chosen to spend the very little amount of free time that she has with us today in this really important conversation. So thanks, Taylit.
Thanks a lot for having me, Jen.
All right, so those are our panelists. And before we get into the main discussion, I just want to share 2 submissions we got from the participants, so you, the audience, about what breaking the bias means to you. Many of these have been shared on social media this week by Waterloo Science, and I really encourage you to check those out. But there was 2 that were very impactful for me, so I'm just going to share them now. So Mira shared that what breaking the bias means to them is to help the next generation live without fear, prevent discrimination, and to live well. And that's just really impactful for me, because it seems like a basic human right to live without fear. And that's why it's really important to have these kind of conversations that we're having today. And Lynn shared that breaking the bias means to them that in their field, which is dominated by males, there's still room to educate and enlighten more people that qualifications are not dependent on gender. I think I love this statement that qualifications are not dependent on gender, and it's something I think we need to think about. So I'd like to invite the panelists to all turn their videos back on, and I've been talking for way too long. So let's get this conversation started. And let's start by digging a little bit deeper into what this idea of breaking the bias means to our panelists. So we can think about this breaking the bias in terms of breaking intentional or unconscious biases. And we can think about it, how it's impacted in our daily lives, our family lives, or our work lives in our career. So I'll ask Nezra to start us off here. Can you speak a little bit more about what this concept of breaking the bias means to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to get the conversation started. So when I think about how far women have come, it really is inspiring, right? So historically, women could really only participate in society in a limited number of ways, right? Supporting men, childbearing, and now we've come such a long way, but I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So there are women who are in the workforce who still face, the gender gap in terms of pay, in terms of leadership opportunities, in terms of just biases in general in the workplace. But also women who choose to stay home and have children or run their own business. There's also judgment and stigma around those decisions. And so I feel like, to me, breaking the bias is just really opening it wide open and letting women define success however they want to do that, whether it's having a family, working in an office and being a CEO, doing both maybe, and accommodating those choices. And also when I think about, when you think about the gender gap, there's a gap within that too, right? So there are women of color, Indigenous women, women of varying abilities and disabilities who fare worse than their other female counterparts. And so when we think about, I think, breaking the bias, I think it's critically important to make sure that women can define success however they like, and that includes all types of women. And that inclusion and diversity is important to raising all women and their contributions to society.
Awesome. That That's great. So the other panels can jump in, or maybe I'll just throw it over to Diana to maybe talk a little bit more about what breaking the bias means to you.
Sure. I think Nasser brought all great points in terms of, speaking up in all areas in our lives, be it our family or in our careers. I think a lot of times as women, we tend to, I don't want to paint a broad, stroke here in terms of, how we are as people, but I think there's just this natural tendency to want to be quiet. And just because we're not speaking in meetings or we're not speaking up, it doesn't mean, we don't have anything to say. I think a lot of times we have things to say. And, as Jen brought up earlier, there's this feeling of fear, and it could happen in various points in your life where, you walk away from a situation, you think to yourself, hey, maybe I should have said something, or I too often I've walked away from things where, I thought to myself, hey, that was an opportunity. And so I encourage others to, break the bias by speaking up, and as much as possible. I think this is one of the things that just takes practice. And it's both speaking up, but also encouraging others to do so and making space for them to speak. I talk a little bit about, DuckDuckGo is remote, and I work in a remote company. And it's unique in the sense that when there is opportunity for people to speak, we can say, hey, it's now this person's turn to speak. Everybody else can mute. It's encouraging folks, women, to be able to speak when given the opportunity to speak, and also leading by example and continuing to do so. Yeah, I love that, Diana. And even beyond being afraid to speak up, sometimes when we're speaking up, we're not even using our own voices. And that's the part that I find the most tragic, where women feel like they need to accommodate or assimilate to the voice of the crowd, which is typically men in STEM and in leadership and in the decision-making tables. There does seem to be this kind of trend of identifying what voice is the most receptive and most comfortable for everyone to hear. And so I think women tend to be very adept at assimilating that voice and using that voice. But I know from my perspective, I don't do my best work when I'm not coming as my full self. And so when I realized that I need to speak in my own voice and make the space for others to speak in their voice at those tables, everyone's able to come and do their best work. So, I think that's something that is beyond being quiet, but it's just that tendency to assimilate. And I think women bringing their real perspectives and their true voices can make problem solving much more rich and much more representative of people that the problems are going to impact, or the solutions are going to impact. And just in government, a specific example is just being very conservative, not being willing to take risks and being the one that's kind of, quiet in voice, but very measured in approach, rather than, seeing some men being much more risk-taking and much more, ability to just to propose bigger plans and have people hear that. The voices are very different around the table.
Oh, definitely, and I can easily relate and echo what Diana and Asra and Liz have said. So I'm a bit I'm not, as Jen mentioned during the introductions, I'm currently based out of Geneva in Switzerland. I've been living in Switzerland now for the past 5 or 6 years, and before that I was based out of Morocco. Morocco is where I grew up, and that's where I've lived my entire life. except for the few years I spent in Canada attending UW. But and it's very different. So what you currently see in a lot of the Western countries, developed economies, and still, I would say, I think North America is extremely advanced, and all of the sacrifices that have been done until now are certainly not to be taken for granted. And I think the next generation need to keep voicing not only the needs of diversity, right? Not just obviously women, but also just gender in general, racial equity and so forth. Now, coming back to my personal experience growing up in Morocco, returning to Morocco after graduating from Waterloo was actually probably the biggest cultural shock I have ever encountered. I was brought up in a very patriarchal environment. And my father was actually the one breaking the bias for me, which is quite surprising. I'm the oldest of three daughters, and my dad had three daughters only. And he was trying to put everything he could to ensure that we would always be independent financially, intellectually, spiritually, and having to defend ourselves as women growing up and having to be as powerful as possible and independent as possible in this community. And so although joining a multinational corporation after school, having that mindset of coming in with, all of the values I was brought up with wasn't easy. And it wasn't easy just because I obviously was very different to this, to the typical status quo education of men and women you would typically find in our culture back then. And it was just extremely difficult for me to flourish and to grow in such an environment. And at first, back to, I think Diana was the one mentioning that a lot of the folks, most of the time you find yourselves in a situation where you just have to fit in. And that's what I tried to do, but it just did not stick with who I truly was as a person. And every morning before going to work, I just had that gut feeling deep inside of me, that is not who I am. Those are not the values I have. I cannot keep up with that. And so I was very much afraid because everybody was telling me, well, you have a job, you should be happy with the job you have. But that was not what I wanted for myself. And I wanted to make sure that I had a very engaged and showed also an example to a lot of the early female leaders around me that it was okay to step away. And I actually quit without even having anything else in front of me, just because it just did not stick with my values and what I thought, what would be true to be motivated.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate hearing about all of your concepts of what break the bias means to you. And I think one theme that came up a lot in what everyone has said is this whole idea of, the importance of breaking through the noise and not being afraid to actually use your voice and to stand up for yourself and advocate for yourself when you are confronted with these biases. And we can kind of think about that when you've sort of had to do that on like a personal level for yourself, or perhaps when you've had to do that for other women through like supportive or mentorship roles. So I was wondering if we could just kind of talk about that for a little bit. So maybe we'll start off kind of on the personal level, and we can just kind of talk about how specifically how women need to sort of use our voices to advocate for ourselves. If you'd like, you could give a personal example and then, sort of what you learned from that, or just speak a little bit more generally to that. And Taylor, I'm going to ask you to start us off on this one.
Absolutely. And I really apologize because I hear two screaming babies in the background. So I hope everything is okay, that, it's not interrupting the webinar. I apologize for that. And tying back to that, as Jen mentioned, I recently had twins, and I'm super happy and proud of where I've come in my career, in my professional life. But it took me quite some time to be able to materialize this dream I also had of having a family. And so I'm obviously I'm 40 years old now, so coming super late into the game with kids, but really happy I was able to make that happen. And one of the things was the fear of having motherhood interfere with my professional development. And so, you know, coming back to what I was mentioning earlier on about advocating for myself and what's the term that we use a lot? Yes, role modeling, but also walking the talk, where I was seeing all these years pass by, nothing happening, a lot happening on the professional front, not much happening on the personal side. And, you know, right before the pandemic hit, you know, during the pandemic, a lot of the global corporations, and I'm sure even smaller ones, well-being became a massive objective. But right before the pandemic hit, I was working on my personal development goals with my manager at the start of the year, and he asked me, and I had well-being on there, and he asked me, hey, how do you think you're going to be measuring up against that? And deep inside of me, I was like, do I tell him? Do I not tell him? Do I tell him? Do I not tell him? I was so tired of traveling every single week, traveling across the world, although I was really motivated and fueled and energized by the job I had. But I knew I had to put an end to that if I really wanted my personal goals to become true. And so I just decided to come out and say, well, if I'm pregnant by the end of the year, I will have achieved that well-being goal. And surprisingly, I wasn't too sure of what reaction was expected, but I got so much support from him. And for me, I think that was a bit of an aha moment, saying, hey, you know, if you do speak up, and even if it's not a woman you have in front of you, we've got fantastic allies as men, as managers supporting us. And you won't know whether what your personal needs will be supported or not until you actually speak up. And so once again, it's not always easy to do, but I can, you know, trust me and believe me, according to what I've experienced over the past 15 years, is once you put these matters on the table, you do end up getting the support you need. And if you don't, and you don't feel like you're being yourself, or you're being granted what you truly believe is important to you, I think it's also okay to walk away and step away. And quite frankly, I think I would have probably resigned had I not felt the support was necessary. At the end of the day, your personal life is probably what's more important, and you can't excel professionally if you don't have that perfect balance between what you want personally and professionally.
That's great. Anyone who wants to jump in on this one, that'd be great.
All right, I'll go. You know, so I have a 20-year career, and I was in consulting, and now I'm in government. And you know, as a consultant, working for you know, people who have I guess real tight deadlines, tight budgets, a lot of, you know, high pressure environment. Coming into it as a junior professional, there was the insidious kind of level of I would call it disrespect of my profession, my abilities as a young woman, which I guess my own bias at that time was that was probably correct. You know, I probably wasn't experienced. I probably wasn't as smart as I thought I was. I adapted to be able to provide the work that I needed to provide. Some of my adaptations were bringing senior white-haired men with me to meetings so that that person could stand there and nod while I was, you know, delivering my information and, you know, making my recommendations. And questions would be directed to the white-haired senior guy in the room. I would answer them. So, I mean, that's blatant and obvious. And you know, when those sort of things started happening, my company was very supportive of that. I mean, when things are so blatant like that, it's just so easy to make change, right? I've had clients pat my bum. I've had, you know, all sorts of inappropriate advances. Those kind of things almost are like, yeah, here we go, because they're so easy to address, and it's so easy to help someone be accountable for those kind of actions. I've honestly been pretty well supported, but it's really those, the challenges come where it's those more insidious, did that really happen? Did that person really mean that? And those are the times when it really takes a network of people that you can connect with to unpack certain, interactions that you've had. Like, I can't think of a specific example, but the feeling is just so familiar right now. And I think, I see everyone nodding, and I've just really, and some of the people are on the call right now that, so true, Elizabeth, and Nalia Parker is one of the people that I would naturally call to talk about that. Like, so this happened, and I think that's very important, and you should have a network of people and you shouldn't just assume that you misunderstood it, because people do need to be held accountable to make change. And so do that, unpack those things. Don't assume that you just misunderstood it. Don't give people the benefit of the doubt every time, because that'll wear at you. It'll sit with you and it'll wear at you, and it'll help form how you see yourself as well in the long term, just my experience. Just another little thing though, I don't know, maybe Diana and Nazra could comment, but just, there's certain women in that I deal with that are older who have made, they've been the trailblazers in the organization, in the industry, and they've kind of, they've adapted to a boys club, and they've had to suffer the pain of being the first person at the table. And, there's a couple of first people at the table within our team right now. And dealing with them has almost been the bigger barrier, because they're the ones that are often correcting my behavior, giving me pointers about how to behave in certain scenarios that I think are very sexist and very biased to me being a woman at that table and needing to conduct myself a certain way. So I don't know if anyone else has that experience with like kind of older generations in the workplace.
Sorry, go ahead, Diana. I saw you unmute first.
I was thinking about what Elizabeth was asking, and I think being in tech, there are fewer women. We could unpack that, but it's largely a male-dominated industry. I actually wish there were more women trailblazers that I could lean on and figure out what their stories, their journey is at the moment. But I do understand the sense in what she's asking in terms of, this is a really tough environment to work. Like, I'm living it right now, where it is difficult to push through, a male-dominated industry where it's getting better, but like at the top, it's still very male-dominated. Where women have to display this certain, I guess, persona where it's like more aggressive and less empathetic, and I see it, and it is difficult to navigate and work with in the industry. I think it's become a little bit more progressive in tech, and where we are more encouraged to be a little bit more authentic. But it's generally, it is difficult as well. And I think that speaks towards having both male and female allies in the organization, where, not all women are going to be your friend in your career journey in that way, depending on kind of, how they see you and the interactions and the history of the relationship. But most generally, I found that in my career, the way to kind of navigate through this is to really partner with both male and females to kind of get your 360 kind of perspective on how whether or not you're being gaslighted in a meeting, and whether or not you're figuring out whether or not your path sort of makes sense for you. I don't know if that makes sense, Nazra, if you want to jump in.
No, that totally made sense to me. But I was going to say that I don't have a particular example around sort of older generations necessarily, having being barriers to my success. But I do want to touch on something that Elizabeth said around like sort of these more low key examples where you're like, you're not sure, like, did that really, like, they didn't smack my butt, which I'm so sorry that happened to you, Elizabeth. That sounds terrible, but did they say that to me because I'm a woman? And, the example I can think of is I started a new management job fairly recently at an organization and was assigned to help one of my colleagues run an advisory committee. And he was a male colleague. And we met for the first time to see what the division of labor was. And this committee met like for about an hour and a half every 2 weeks. So it was quite often. And I was really stunned to hear him say the very first thing was, you should just take all the notes and I'll facilitate all the discussion. My notes are horrible anyways. I've seen your notes are great. And I love my notes. I'm very happy to participate. And I don't remember who said it earlier, so I'm sorry, but this concept of using your voice and speaking up, I hesitated in that moment because I was new. I wanted to not ruffle feathers. I wanted to be nice. I wanted to be polite, but I instinctively thought, we're at the same level. We have the same sort of graduate education. We have similar experiences. There's no really good reason why I need to just take notes for this person while they go ahead and showboat at these meetings. And so it's those, you reflect on those moments after and you think, did that happen and why? I did in that moment say, I don't love that idea. And I did push back a little bit and said, I know I'm new here. I'm happy to take notes the very first time. Next time, how about we rotate? You take notes and I facilitate. And we actually went ahead with that schedule. His notes were actually fine. So it ended up being okay. And he's a little stunned in that moment, but I thought it was important to set that boundary, right? Like I can contribute in valuable ways outside of just being administrative support. And I challenged him on that. I think he was a little stunned, but I think we actually now have a good, respectful relationship. And I think it ended up being a positive, despite it being uncomfortable in that moment, being very positive. But Elizabeth, when you said, does this happen, when you reflect on whether this is truly, a bias or is this why is this happening? You're not sure. It's not as overt as someone, grabbing your bottom, which is horrible too. But those things seep into a lot of different conversations in the workplace. And it's really good to have a support system to ask and talk about, did that happen because, because of this, that, and anyways, I'll stop there, but.
That's great. I think that was a really good conversation. And Nezra, I like that you kind of brought it back around to that first point that, it is really important to use your voice and to advocate for yourself. And even if it's in hindsight that you figure out that you should have done it, the next time, how to react in that situation. So let's just switch gears for a second. So in a lot of your first statements when you're talking about what breaking the bias meant to you, a lot of you talked about this idea of diversity of voices. And so, I think as women continue to gain and strengthen our position of influence, it's really important. And in fact, even our responsibility to actively make space for that diverse range of voices to be heard. And so I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about this and just if you could let me know what this idea of bringing in a diversity of voices to decision making, what that means to you and how we can actually accomplish that task. So Diana, can I get you to start that one?
Sure. I think in terms of, trying to get everyone to kind of speak up in meetings, for me, I like to make sure that anyone who is attending my meeting has a speaking role. I think, I know it's not possible in these bigger scale meetings, these all hands of some people have 50 to 100 people on these calls, but just generally, if you're thinking about a project that has there's usually a handful of people that have a direct hand into moving something forward. And the example I'll give is developing a product. There's usually one marketing, a few engineers, one product person, and so forth. And so basically, everybody should have some airtime to speak on this. And one of the things that I found helpful when I'm coaching others that I find are quiet is something that someone said to me when I was early in my career and still finding my voice. I mentioned to Jen when we first met that earlier in my career, I used to speak very quickly and very quietly because I was trying to get to the point as quickly as possible because I was just so shy and like afraid to voice my opinion. But I had a male ally who was my boss at the time, a mentor of mine, pulled me aside and said, "Hey, you need to slow down and you need to speak more clearly because everybody in that room deserves the same amount of airtime as you." And I paused and I thought about that and I was like, that's why didn't I feel like I was deserving of that airtime? And that always stuck to me. And I remember that when, if I have somebody in a team that isn't speaking up, I will go and give that person a heads up. These are the agenda topics. I'd like your opinion on X, Y, and Z, to kind of give the opportunity for people to kind of think about it and then give them that airtime to speak. And so I find that, both it's a combination of like leading by example and also paving the way to give that person space to speak in order to kind of continually grow and continually speak up and provide opportunities for folks to do so.
I love that idea of having folks have a speaking role, especially in the days of all these virtual meetings, that you can spend a lot of time on Zoom and say a whole lot of nothing. And so it's very important to have a role there. What I also try to do with my team and women that report to me is I've been in a lot of roles that have been great, but I spend a lot of time doing all the hard work and then somebody higher up presents it for me. And so I encourage my staff to present their own work, and I make time for them during our check-ins to do dry runs if they want to practice. And I make sure it's a safe space that they can do that presentation in a way that they can present what they do. I don't need the credit. They did the legwork. And so for me, is especially if they're shy or nervous, making sure that they have the resources, the training, whatever they need to speak publicly if that's what they want to do, but also to present their own work. It doesn't always have to be mine because they're on my team. And so especially, in giving them that space to do that and telling them, warning them in advance that might be an opportunity, unless they feel deeply uncomfortable, that they're expected to participate actively and ask questions. Don't be scared I was scared early in my career to ask questions in meetings in fear of sounding stupid or saying the wrong thing. And that's not a philosophy that we have on our team. So trying to have those conversations and making intentional, goals for them to participate actively, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think what Nazra is doing is just so important, because if people are going to be able to show up and be their best selves, they need that comfort and that coaching and the opportunities and the investment in them for them to have that confidence to be able to bring those diverse voices. You need to also have the diverse voices to bring to the table. And so I know we all talked about hiring practices and how biased they can be and some of the strategies that we had for diverse hiring. But once you have those people there, creating, accommodating and finding out how they do best and creating those conditions for them to be comfortable and feel included so that they can bring their best selves. I mean, that's fundamental. That's just, that has to be done. I also think that, as leaders in the field, as women leaders, we also need to lead by example and create, I guess, share the stories amongst our team in terms of how, I guess that the things that we're being intentional about as our own personal development, we need to share those with our team, because they're the true stories that people remember. And someone telling Diana, like, you deserve to share your voice as much as anyone else in the room, that was probably something that person learned. That was a learned experience, and that person's being very intentional about pointing that out to you. And so leading by example, by being that diverse voice and intentionally sharing that with others, that I am coming here with a diverse voice. And so, I was talking, I think I mentioned this to Jen before, but, just going back to a previous comment I made that sparked a little bit of spicy comments and commentary in the chat there around ageism. But I have been, kind of coached into a different voice in the past by women that were meaning well. And rather than take that advice and say, yeah, okay, I understand that's how we should talk, I actually used that and said, okay, so I am coming with a diverse voice. And so before I start to share my comment, I will say, like, this is probably not, aligned with what you're thinking, and let's think about what I'm saying as, like, what would happen if we did it this way, or what would be the, what would be the impact if we gave that idea some air, particularly with younger people on the team that might come in with ideas that people, younger or newer people, I should say, newer people on the team that might come into an organization and have different ideas wherever they came from, but they can be instantly shot down because everyone around the table has more experience and they know immediately, like, that would never work. But creating that space, the way Nazra has said, encouraging them to speak up, but also in the room saying, I appreciate that you're bringing this here and you're coming from another organization, like, just voicing it, like, yeah, this is what's happening. We don't like this idea because it's new. So what would happen? Like, what would happen if we followed that line of thinking? And often that leads to the solution. It's probably not the original idea that we started with, but putting ourselves in that problem solving and thinking about a diverse idea is what adds on. Oh, well, now we can return to that other idea that we said we couldn't do because we, in kind of imagining mitigation for this idea, this one ended up working really well. So that's, being very intentional about what you're doing when you're bringing those diverse voices to the table, I think takes us, in my experience anyway, takes it to another level.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate your comments. Taylor, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to build a bit on that as well. So my team is scattered all over the world. And so we were a virtual team before the pandemic even hit. We were traveling all the time, meeting in airports, in conferences, but they're all, the international business that I run is worldwide markets with the exception of US and Canada. So I've got team members sitting in Madrid, in Japan, in Australia, in Brazil. And so we have a very diverse group of people, not only from a gender perspective, but also from a cultural perspective. And each year, actually, what we do is when we kind of do a check-in, there's always, when we do the pulse surveys to see, hey, culturally, where do things stand from different perspectives? There's always going to be areas where we score lower than others. It's great to role model. It's great to try and be a problem solver and to have everybody voice what they feel we need to bring to the table to solve it. And the reality is, at the end of the day, is what I have a tendency to do is to say, hey, guys, you all need to be part of the solution. Now let's break out into separate work streams. I want a representation from how would you tackle it down there in Japan, let's say, get together with folks from other countries. You're running this work stream, having the folks sitting in Brazil running a separate work stream, and working across the globe for one common solution, just to make sure we address it. It empowers people. It also ensures that everybody has a voice on the table. It also puts people on the spot. People don't always feel comfortable, but at the end of the day, you naturally see that they're solving for problems on their own. And you're quickly seeing that, at the end of the day, you're driving a lot more innovation and leaving a legacy behind and building a stronger culture by bringing these different perspectives to the table.
That's great, Taylor. I really like how you just kind of summarized that up there at the end. It is really having those diverse perspectives are really going to lead to better decision making and kind of everything that you try to do. And you're right, it can be a little bit uncomfortable for people, but hopefully it's that sort of empowering piece that really people sort of like take away that from those kind of conversations. So we're kind of getting towards the end of our conversation, but I just want to have one other sort of like quick round of comments for the panelists. So there are a lot of either sort of like new alumnus or undergrad students who are watching this call today. And it's really clear from talking to all of you that, you know, part of like breaking the bias and what that means is following your passions and really just kind of going like full steam ahead with the things that you feel really important, that are really important to you, no matter what kind of is in your way. So maybe we'll just kind of go around and I'll start with Diana. You know, if there's kind of like one piece of advice you could kind of leave everyone with, you know, at the end of this talk, what would it be?
Okay, so I had a lot of passions, kind of, you know, graduating from undergrad. You know, I had a passion for cell biology and biotech early in my career, and I had wanted nothing more but to work in that industry. But I also knew that I really loved tech, and I think my takeaway is passions change, and that's okay. I knew there'd be a day where I'd want to, you know, explore other things. So you know, I would hope that, you know, the learnings that you've heard from us today, you know, inspire you to just continue to push forward to whatever you want to explore, to just explore it. You're not boxed into a subject if you're willing to try other things.
I agree with Diana. Passions definitely change. So, you know, what I wanted to do even 10 years ago is very different than what I'm doing now. Things I thought I'd love, I hated. Things I thought I wouldn't really be into, I love. So, you know, piggybacking on what Diana said, try new things, find mentors, talk to people, having informational interviews. People love talking about what they like to do and what they are doing in their day to day. But I also want to just put a plug in for diversity. No matter what you do, make space and time to intentionally hire and work for diverse teams, advocate for folks across the diversity spectrum. It takes time to do this well. Like, it's not something that's easy. It's not just a diversity statement on a website, but when you do have those positions of power, you know, it takes time to do it well, but to really invest that time because it'll be worthwhile, and seek out really diverse voices and folks to work with you. I think it'll make your work stronger. But yeah, try a lot of new things, especially when you're young. I think you have a lot of leeway there and you won't regret those experiences.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I can only echo what both of you have just said. It's extremely important that you just don't go by what society expects you to do or what your direct circle of friends or family expects you to do. Truly, you know, you need to trust your gut instinct and you should not be afraid. And it may feel very scary when you're still young, right out of school, and you feel like you need the pressure of getting a job because you need the money. Try different things, but don't be afraid to walk out. If your gut feeling tells you, hey, I'm not passionate about this, this does not fuel that excitement, that fire inside of me to make sure, you know, that I keep doing what I really want to do. Don't be afraid to walk away, and don't be afraid to speak up when you need to pursue what you truly believe to be your passion.
Yeah, that's, I don't know if I could add anything to that. That's just, you know, I think everyone's really speaking to the fact that the limitations to your passions shouldn't be from the limitations to exploring your passions shouldn't be from social cues or how you put limitations on yourself because of, you know, fear or what people have told you. There's something to be said to take any job if you need to get started, because you can create your own opportunities. You don't necessarily need to find your passion and get a job in line with your passion when you're starting out, because any job you're going to learn something from. And when you are ready for that passion job, then you're going to have a much bigger and much broader base to bring to that. If you're keeping your eyes on the long-term prize.
That's awesome, Elizabeth. Thanks for kind of wrapping that one up. I think you kind of brought a lot of important points together in what you just said. And So with that, I think we're going to kind of bring this to an end. And, this has really been a great conversation today. And I really want to thank all of the panelists for spending the past hour with us, but also for taking the time to meet beforehand so we can kind of sort some things out. And I really appreciate sort of the insight that you've given us sort of into your life and into like your own personal like thoughts and feelings, and for having some of these kind of maybe tougher comments about what breaking the bias means. So thanks a lot to all of the panelists today. I also want to thank the Faculty of Science at the University of Waterloo for supporting this event, and particularly to Megan and Sharon and the rest of the advancement team for helping to make this very important conversation take place. And also, if you have any ideas for events you'd like to see in the future, please get in touch with the advancement team. They're always looking for ideas and suggestions. Most importantly, I want to thank the audience for joining us today. I'm excited to read the chat after. It looks like there's been some really great comments in there. And I know there's a lot of different things that you could choose to spend your time today, a lot of different like sort of online chats about International Women's Day. And I really want to thank you all for spending the time with us today. And have a great rest of your International Women's Day. So thanks everyone. And I think that's it.